It was the middle of the night, a little past 1:42 a.m. on Wednesday, August 6, 1997. A Boeing 747 carrying 254 people was on its final approach to Guam Agana International Airport. The weather was bad, with heavy rain and limited visibility. But as the crew flew through the dark, trusting their instruments to guide them, something went terribly wrong. Instead of lining up for a safe landing, the massive aircraft descended into the jungle just 4.8 kilometers southwest of the runway. Nobody expected this. The crew was working hard to navigate a challenging approach, believing they were on the correct path. But how could a highly trained crew, flying a proven aircraft, find themselves heading directly for the ground on what should have been a standard arrival? I'm Captain James Harlow, and after 28 years in commercial aviation, I've seen how quickly a challenging approach can turn into a disaster. Welcome aboard. Here, we dig into the stories behind air disasters, not just the technical failures, but the human element at play. You have to understand, even the most advanced aircraft are ultimately guided by people. As they continued their descent through the heavy rain and darkness, the Ground Proximity Warning System, or GPWS, began to blare. Think of the GPWS like a highly sensitive car parking sensor, but for the ground. It constantly monitors your distance to the terrain below and warns you if you're getting too close, too fast. The flight engineer called out, 1,000 feet, but moments later, the automated voice of the GPWS cut through the cockpit, yelling, 100 feet, 500, sink rate, pull up, pull up. You have to understand, these are not subtle alerts. This is an urgent, unmistakable warning that you are about to hit the ground. In that challenging environment, with the darkness and heavy rain, the crew faced a complex situation. The captain, focused on trying to visually acquire the runway, was now confronted with these sudden, overwhelming alerts from the GPWS. The first officer and flight engineer promptly called out the warnings, as trained, but precious seconds ticked by. Here's the thing. In those critical moments, a pilot's instinct is to immediately climb, to get away from the ground. But the combination of factors, the darkness, the rain, the confusion surrounding the glide slope status, and the difficulty in fully transitioning their mental model to a non-precision approach without reliable vertical guidance, created a critical delay in their response. The captain finally initiated a climb, pulling back on the controls. But it was too late. The massive Boeing 747-3B5, tail number HL7468, was already too low, too slow, and heading directly into Nimitz Hill, just 4.8 kilometers southwest of the runway threshold. At 1:42 a.m. on Wednesday, August 6, 1997, the aircraft slammed into the jungle. This particular aircraft, built in 1984 and powered by P&W JT9D7 R4G2 engines, was a veteran with 50,105 hours of flight time. The impact was devastating. The airframe was utterly destroyed. Look, when an aircraft hits the ground at flying speed, the forces involved are unimaginable. The fuselage disintegrated, and debris was scattered across a wide area. A fire immediately erupted, consuming much of the wreckage. Of the 254 people on board, 228 lost their lives. Only 26 survived the initial impact and the inferno that followed. To put that in perspective, a survival rate of just over 10% is exceptionally low for a commercial aviation accident, underscoring the severity of the impact and subsequent fire. Can you believe it? 26 people emerged from that horror. Let me tell you who some of these people were. Imagine a young couple excited for their honeymoon on Guam. They had saved for years for this trip, dreaming of white sand beaches and clear blue water. Their entire future, their hopes, vanished in an instant. Or consider a seasoned business executive, traveling frequently between Seoul and Guam for a major development project. He had a wife and 2 children waiting for his return, completely unaware of the tragedy unfolding thousands of miles away. And then there was a dedicated flight attendant on board, perhaps looking forward to a short layover before flying back home, planning to use her earnings to help her family. These weren't just numbers. Each person on that flight was a world, a life, a story. The NTSB investigation, referenced as NTSB/AAR-00-01, was meticulous. It lasted 2 years and 5 months, a testament to the sheer complexity of what happened that night. Investigators didn't just look at the black boxes, they examined everything: the crew's training, the airline's procedures, air traffic control's equipment, and even the cultural nuances that might have affected communication within the cockpit and with controllers. One of the critical findings revolved around the Minimum Safe Altitude Warning System, or MSAW, at Guam's air traffic control. This system is designed to alert controllers if an aircraft is flying too low. However, local technicians had modified it to reduce what they considered nuisance alerts. You have to understand, a nuisance alert is when a system warns you about something that isn't an actual danger, like a terrain feature that is technically below the safe altitude but poses no immediate threat. But here's the thing: by reducing its sensitivity, they effectively rendered the MSAW less effective, like turning down the volume on your smoke detector because it sometimes goes off when you burn toast. On that night, the system did not trigger a warning to the controller in time. Even as Flight 801 descended below safe altitudes, nobody saw this coming, not the crew and not the ground controllers. The investigation highlighted a critical lesson: that seemingly small modifications to safety systems can have profound, unforeseen consequences. After this accident, there was a major push to review and standardize how such systems are maintained and modified worldwide. The NTSB report emphasized that safety systems like MSAW and GPWS are vital layers of protection, and any alteration must be carefully considered and universally applied, not just locally decided. It was a brutal reminder that every single safety protocol exists for a reason, and bypassing them, even with good intentions, can have devastating outcomes. The crew was operating in a challenging environment. Pay attention to this detail. The glide slope signal, which provides crucial vertical guidance to the runway, was out of service for runway 6 left. This meant that the Instrument Landing System, or ILS, was not fully functional. For pilots, this is a significant change. Imagine trying to drive a car down a precise ramp in the dark using only side markers instead of having a clear laser beam guiding your path from above. That's the difference between a precision approach and what's called a non-precision approach. In a non-precision approach, pilots rely on lateral guidance and step-down altitudes, using specific waypoints to descend to the minimum descent altitude, or MDA, before they can visually acquire the runway. It's far more demanding, especially in bad weather and at night. Here's the thing: the crew had received a NOTAM, a Notice to Airmen, which is a mandatory briefing detailing changes or hazards, informing them about the inoperative glide slope. However, there appeared to be a persistent expectation in the cockpit that the glide slope might become available, or perhaps a difficulty in fully adjusting their mental model from the more common precision approach to the demands of a non-precision one. The first officer even mentioned, "Glide slope is not working," but despite this, they made multiple attempts to activate it, trying different modes on their flight management computers. This meant they were flying a non-precision approach, but perhaps still holding on to the expectation of precision guidance, which simply wasn't available. Air traffic control at Guam tried to help. The controller informed them that their approach was approved. Despite the heavy rain and poor visibility, the crew continued their descent. The flight engineer was diligently monitoring the systems, calling out altitudes. The captain was focused on flying the aircraft and trying to acquire visual contact with the runway lights. The first officer was also monitoring instruments and communicating with the captain, but they were all battling the deteriorating conditions and the absence of that crucial vertical guidance. And that's where it all went wrong. The weather worsened even further, with heavy rain and poor visibility, making it nearly impossible to see anything outside the cockpit. The captain, focused on flying the aircraft and trying to acquire visual contact with the runway lights, believed he saw the runway at one point. But it was a false impression, likely caused by lights reflecting off the clouds or the heavy rain. This human desire to see the runway, especially after a long flight and in challenging conditions, can sometimes create a powerful but deceptive illusion, even for experienced pilots. They descended past the minimum descent altitude of 680 feet. This was the critical point at which they should have either seen the runway and continued their approach, or initiated a go-around. A go-around, is the command to abort the landing and climb away safely. But they were below the MDA, yet still deep within the clouds, with absolutely no visual contact with the ground or the runway. The crew continued to descend, believing they were on a normal path, unaware of the treacherous terrain rising directly before them in the darkness. You have to understand, cockpit communication is vital, especially when things go wrong. In many Western airlines, there's a strong emphasis on crew resource management, or CRM. This is a framework that encourages all crew members, regardless of rank, to speak up if they see something wrong or have a concern. It's about building a culture where everyone feels empowered to contribute to safety. But in some aviation cultures at the time, there was a more hierarchical structure where junior officers might hesitate to directly challenge or contradict the captain. This isn't to say the crew wasn't professional. Far from it. Every pilot on that flight was highly trained and dedicated. However, the subtle dynamics of communication, the way concerns are raised or not raised, can have profound effects, particularly under stress and in a rapidly deteriorating situation. The NTSB investigation would later delve deeply into these cultural aspects. They examined how such dynamics might have contributed to the crew's delayed recognition of their predicament. It was a critical human factor that many investigations were only beginning to fully understand. It highlighted that safety isn't just about machines, but also about how people interact within them. This was a challenging insight, suggesting that sometimes the problem wasn't a lack of information, but a delay in effectively interpreting or acting upon it due to ingrained communication patterns. For some, this aspect of the investigation sparked debate as it ventured into areas beyond purely technical failures. Nobody saw this coming, the full extent of how culture could play a role. The first officer, having previously mentioned the glide slope was not working, did not explicitly challenge the captain's decision to continue descending below the minimum descent altitude without visual contact with the runway. The flight engineer continued to call out altitudes, but the significance of being below the MDA in such conditions was not fully addressed as a critical deviation requiring immediate action. There was no clear, unified decision to execute a go-around until it was too late. The captain finally called for a go-around, the command to abort the landing and climb away, but by then, the aircraft was already critically low, losing altitude rapidly, and the terrain was too close. The time for an effective recovery was slipping away. Suddenly, the cockpit was filled with blaring, urgent warnings from the ground proximity warning system. The system screamed, "Whoop, whoop, pull up," and repeated, "Sink rate, pull up, pull up." These are unmistakable, immediate warnings that the aircraft is dangerously close to terrain below it. The crew reacted instantly, a trained response to an emergency. They pulled back on the controls, trying to climb away from the invisible threat. The engines spooled up to maximum power, their roar filling the cockpit as the massive aircraft fought desperately against gravity and its own momentum. The cockpit lights flashed red, an urgent, intense display of danger. The captain, first officer, and flight engineer were braced, muscles straining, pulling back on the controls with all their might. The massive Boeing 747 shuddered violently, engines roaring, trying to claw its way skyward. Here's the thing, a Boeing 747, even with its immense power, is a behemoth. It has a tremendous amount of inertia, meaning it strongly resists changes in motion. When you are already flying below the minimum descent altitude, in heavy rain, and directly into rising terrain, it takes time and distance for such a large aircraft to change its trajectory and climb away effectively. In the cabin, the sudden, violent lurch forward threw passengers against their seatbelts. Many were jolted awake, a chorus of screams rising above the roar of the engines and the pelting rain. The interior lights flickered, then died, plunging the cabin into an eerie, almost total darkness, punctuated only by flashes of lightning outside. Then came the sickening, grinding crunch as the aircraft's belly scraped against the dense jungle canopy. Trees, thick and unyielding, tore at the wings, stripping away metal. The sound was deafening, a terrifying symphony of screeching metal, splintering wood, and shattering glass. The forces were immense, twisting the airframe, throwing everything and everyone forward with brutal, unyielding momentum. Debris exploded outwards. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but chaos, a terrifying, all-consuming roar, and then an abrupt, profound silence. The cockpit lights flash red, an urgent, intense display of danger. The captain, first officer, and flight engineer are braced, muscles straining, pulling back on the controls with all their might. The massive Boeing 747 shudders violently, engines roaring as they spool up to maximum power, trying to claw its way skyward. This trained response to the pull-up warning is immediate. They pull back on the controls, and the engines respond with full power, but it is simply too late. Here's the thing. A Boeing 747, even with its immense power, is a behemoth. It carries a tremendous amount of inertia, meaning it strongly resists any sudden changes to its motion. When an aircraft this size is already flying below the safe altitude, in heavy rain, and directly into rising terrain, there is simply not enough time or altitude to recover. The sheer mass and momentum mean that even with full power applied, it cannot instantaneously defy gravity and climb out of danger. The ground, shrouded in darkness and rain, comes up too quickly. The battle against physics, in those final seconds, is unwinnable. They had run out of sky. In the cabin, the sudden, violent lurch forward throws passengers against their seatbelts. Many are jolted awake, a chorus of screams rising above the roar of the engines and the pelting rain. The interior lights flicker, then die, plunging the cabin into an eerie, almost total darkness, punctuated only by flashes of lightning outside. Then comes the sickening, grinding crunch as the aircraft's belly scrapes against the dense jungle canopy. Trees, thick and unyielding, tear at the wings, stripping away metal. The sound is deafening, a horrifying symphony of screeching metal, splintering wood, and shattering glass. The forces are immense, truly bone-jarring, twisting the entire airframe, throwing everything and everyone forward with brutal, unyielding momentum. Debris explodes outwards with incredible force. For a few agonizing seconds, there is nothing but chaos, a terrifying, all-consuming roar, and then an abrupt, profound silence. In the immediate aftermath, a profound, eerie silence settles over the crash site, broken only by the persistent Guam rain and the crackling of small fires. For the few who survived the initial impact, it is a scene of utter devastation. Disoriented, injured, and in shock, they begin to crawl from the mangled wreckage, navigating through twisted metal, splintered trees, and the overwhelming smell of jet fuel. The dense jungle environment itself makes any movement excruciatingly difficult. Meanwhile, on the ground, emergency services on Guam are scrambling. Alerted by the aircraft's sudden disappearance from radar, they know something is terribly wrong. But finding the precise location, deep within the dense jungle, in the pitch black of night and amidst the heavy rain, is an enormous challenge. First responders face a daunting task, battling through difficult terrain just to reach the site. It is a race against time. Back in Seoul, thousands of kilometers away, families of those on board are still asleep, unaware of the tragedy that has unfolded. The National Transportation Safety Board immediately mobilizes its team. Their initial priorities are clear: secure the dangerous crash site, locate the critical flight recorders, the so-called black boxes, and begin the painstaking process of understanding what led to this tragedy. First, the investigation uncovered a deeply concerning aspect of human factors: the crew's persistent expectation of the glide slope. You have to understand, even with the explicit notice to airmen stating the glide slope was out of service, the flight crew's mental model seemed to cling to the possibility of it being merely intermittent, or perhaps that it would suddenly become available. This isn't about ignoring information, it's about how the human brain processes and prioritizes data under stress. This subconscious anticipation meant that instead of fully committing to the demanding requirements of a non-precision approach, where every altitude and distance check is critical, they were still, in part, searching for a precision signal that was simply not there. Here's the thing: this cognitive bias created a profound disconnect between the actual conditions and the crew's perception. They were trying to make the real-world situation conform to their expectation, rather than adapting to the reality of flying an unguided approach in bad weather. This subtle but critical shift in focus meant they were less rigorous in monitoring their vertical path, inadvertently allowing the aircraft to descend below the minimum descent altitude without the required visual contact. This particular failure highlights how crucial it is for crews to not only receive information, but to fully internalize and adapt their flight plan to the precise conditions, leaving no room for hopeful assumptions. Second, the investigation pointed to critical deficiencies in crew resource management, or CRM, within the cockpit.
You have to understand, CRM is designed to ensure all crew members, regardless of their position, can effectively communicate and challenge decisions that might compromise safety. In this case, while the first officer and flight engineer did voice concerns about the glide slope and the aircraft's low altitude, these interventions lacked the assertiveness needed to prompt an immediate change in the captain's course of action. It wasn't that they stayed silent, it was that their warnings, while present, did not break through the captain's focus or the existing cockpit dynamics with enough force to prevent the continued descent. Here's the thing. The NTSB concluded that the subtle influences of hierarchy and established communication styles, particularly under the high-pressure environment of a challenging night approach in bad weather, seemed to inhibit a more direct and forceful intervention. The crew was professional, but the system of checks and balances within the cockpit, which CRM aims to strengthen, did not function robustly enough. This meant that the crucial decision to initiate a go-around was delayed until the very last seconds, when the aircraft was already too low to recover. This accident served as a stark reminder that effective CRM isn't just about speaking up. It's about ensuring that critical safety messages are heard and acted upon decisively. Third, a critical safety net on the ground, the Minimum Safe Altitude Warning System, or MSAW, at Guam's air traffic control, had been fundamentally compromised. You have to understand, these systems are designed as an independent, automated layer of defense, a last resort to alert controllers if an aircraft descends too low. However, local technicians in Guam had intentionally modified the MSAW system. Their rationale was to reduce what they perceived as nuisance alerts, which were frequently triggered by the island's naturally complex terrain.
While their intent might have been to improve operational efficiency, the practical effect was to severely desensitize the system. And that's where it all went wrong. By reducing its sensitivity, the MSAW was rendered largely ineffective at detecting dangerously low-flying aircraft. On that fateful night, as Flight 801 descended below safe altitudes, this desensitized system failed to trigger a timely warning to the air traffic controller. This meant that a vital, independent opportunity to intervene and alert the crew to their peril was completely lost. The decision to unilaterally modify such a critical safety tool, without rigorous evaluation or standardized oversight, created a profound and fatal gap in the entire safety chain. It was a stark lesson on the absolute importance of maintaining safety systems as designed, without unauthorized alterations that can strip away crucial layers of protection. The NTSB investigation into Korean Air Flight 801 meticulously uncovered a combination of factors, not a single cause. It highlighted a persistent challenge in the crew's full adaptation to the inoperative glide slope, leading them to continue their descent without reliable vertical guidance. The report also pointed to significant issues in crew resource management, where the first officer and flight engineer's concerns, while present, lacked the assertiveness needed to prompt an immediate change in the captain's course of action. And that's where it all went wrong. Compounded by the profoundly desensitized minimum safe altitude warning system on the ground, which failed to provide its crucial alert, the learnings from this tragedy profoundly influenced aviation safety worldwide, leading to the widespread adoption of Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning Systems, or EGPWS. This advanced technology uses a global terrain database to predict and warn pilots of impending terrain conflicts far more effectively than previous systems. The Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, made EGPWS mandatory for most large turbine-powered aircraft operating in the United States by March 29, 2001. This single regulatory change, alongside reinforced crew resource management training and clearer communication protocols, is widely credited with saving hundreds, if not thousands, of lives by drastically reducing controlled flight into terrain accidents in commercial aviation. The 228 souls lost on Flight 801 on that dark night in Guam ultimately contributed to a safer sky for countless future travelers. The local modification to the minimum safe altitude warning system in Guam, intended to reduce nuisance alerts, was a critical contributing factor in this accident. Here's a question I've been thinking about. What level of centralized oversight is truly necessary when local teams propose modifications to fundamental safety systems like the MSAW? Where do we draw the line between local operational efficiency and universal safety standards? Look, if you found this deep dive into Korean Air Flight 801 insightful, please consider hitting the like button. It is a small, free action that truly helps this independent channel reach more people and continue telling these vital stories. If you are new here and you appreciate this kind of content, please subscribe and become a part of our community. I would love to hear your thoughts on the question about local modifications to safety systems in the comments below. Where do you think the balance lies between local operational needs and the need for stringent, centralized oversight for crucial systems like the MSAW? I read every comment, and your perspectives always add to the conversation.